Hello everyone, today we are going to be talking about supply and demand on today's podcast. I am Nareg, this is
Natalie.
and this is.
Sophie.
So what is the law of demand? The law of demand is when consumers buy more of a good when its price decreases, but less when the price increases. So there are behavior patterns to price increasing. For example, there is the income effect and there is the substitution effect. So Sophie, why don't you tell us what the income effect is?
The income effect is when change in consumption resulting from a change in real income.
Why don't you tell us now what the substitution effect is?
So the substitution effect is consuming less of that good and more of other goods.
Yes, good job, guys. These are the behavior patterns to price increasing. So there are demand schedules. Demand schedules are a market demand schedule, a table that lists the quantity of a good and the person that will buy at each different price. For example, we could construct a demand curve. When transferring numbers from a demand schedule,
You can label the vertical axis with the lowest possible prices at the bottom and the highest at the top.
and you could also
Label the quantities demanded on the horizontal axis with the lowest possible quantity on the left.
what causes a shift?
So there can be income of both normal goods and inferior goods. There can also be consumer expectations when sales price increases.
See, it also population could cause a shift, and consumers' taste and advertising. Like trends can be unpredictable.
You never know what's gonna happen.
Yes. Prices related goods. So there's complements and substitutes. So
Complements are two goods that are frequently bought and used together, like peanut butter and jelly.
and then there's substitutes
Goods used in place of another good.
like
So,
hot dogs and hamburgers. So then we're gonna go on to the elasticity of demand. So this is
It's a measure of how consumers react to a change in price.
so there's elastic, which is a demand is very sensitive to change, and there's
Inelastic, which is a demand that is not sensitive to change. Okay, so here are some factors that affect elasticity. We have available substitutes, which are medicine and generic items. We also have
we have relative importance, like how much of your budget is spent on the item.
And there's also necessities versus luxuries, where you decide which item is a necessity and which is a luxury, so which you need to buy more of.
Kind of like milk and steak, right?
Yes, very much like milk and steak. Oh, we also have change over time, and that's when an example could be like big cars versus economical cars.
Very good.
Now we're gonna move on to the law of supply.
Law of supply is the tendency of a supplier to offer more of a good at a higher price. Quantity supplied.
Okay, so we have quantity supplied, and that's the amount that a supplier is willing to supply at a certain price.
As the price of a good rises,
Firms will then produce more goods in order to gain revenue. New firms will have an incentive to enter the market.
higher production. If the price of a producing of a good stays the same, then the increased production will raise profits.
Okay, so if the price of producing a good rises, then an increase of production will reduce profits.
What is a supply schedule?
A supply schedule is a chart that lists how much of a good a supplier will offer at a different price point. Okay, so we have quantity supplied, and that's the amount that a supplier is willing to supply at a certain price.
As the price of a good rises,
Firms will then produce more goods in order to gain revenue. New firms will have an incentive to enter the market.
higher production. If the price of a producing of a good stays the same, then the increased production will raise profits. What is a supply schedule?
A supply schedule is a chart that lists how much of a good a supplier will offer at a different price point.
What is a market supply schedule, Nat?
So this is a chart that actually lists how much of a good all suppliers will offer at different prices.
Oh.
Yeah.
What about elasticity of a supply?
The elasticity of supply is a measure of the way quantity supplied reacts to a change in price.
You have anything else to say about that?
So it basically means an increase in price causes a smaller percent change in supply. And firms usually have difficulty increasing supply in response to a rise in price.
Next, we're going to be talking about the supply curve. Always rise from the left to the right, opposite of a demand curve. Now there's cost of production, which is
So cost of production has two main things. There's labor and output, and there's also production costs.
Yes. Labor and output. How many workers should be hired, Sophie?
As many as you can afford.
Exactly. Production cost. What is a fixed cost, Sophie?
A fixed cost is a cost that does not change no matter how much of a good is produced.
Okay, so variable cost is a cost that rises or falls depending on how much is produced.
Okay, next we're going to be talking about changes in supply. For example, input costs, government influence, supply and global economy, and other influences. Input costs, rising costs of raw material, rising costs of labor. Rising costs of labor could be raises, minimum wage increases, and etc.
Okay, so governments have strong influence over supply, and that's an example of that is subsidy, so a government payment that supports a business or market.
There's also
Taxes and regulations. For example, an excise tax, where the government places a higher tax on a good they don't want people buying a lot of, like alcohol or cigarettes.
supply and global market. The United States imports carpets from India, telephones from Japan, oil from several countries like Canada. Other influences on supply could be future expectations, which could be
The housing market.
or
Inflation.
also another influence on supply could be number of suppliers.
Now we're going to be talking about prices. So yeah,
So there's the balancing of the market, which could be a demand schedule or supply schedule, and then there's why don't you tell us about the equilibrium?
Price equilibrium is the point at which quantity demanded and quantity supplied are equal.
Nat, why don't you tell us about disequilibrium?
so disequilibrium is when quantity supplied is not equal to quality demanded in a market, and that can lead to excess demand, which is
A low price encouraging buyers and discouraging sellers.
there are also
No, you
changes in
didn't.
market equilibrium, so a change in supply due to the decrease in demand will also affect price.
Avoid a surplus.
Changes in market equilibrium. Changes in demand will increase supply and affect price.
Avoid a shortage.
So government intervention, so there's types of price control, which is
Price ceilings and price flooring. Price ceilings is a maximum price that can legally be charged for a good or a service. Apartment rentals in New York City. Or price floors could be a minimum price for a good or service, like minimum wage. Prices.
so the advantage of prices are that prices are an incentive and they reveal information.
Prices are also
Signals. They can say what's hot and what's not. Also, flexibility. Roll with the changes.
good job. An advantage of price-driven economy is the diversity of goods and services.
We got a lot of choices.
Market problems.
So a possible problem in a market economy can be imperfect competition, so not enough sellers.
Or
Imperfect information, which buyers.
if buyers and sellers do not have enough information to make informed choices about a product. So this is what we have to say about supply and demand. So we are signing out. We see you next week on our podcast. So I am Nadig, and this is
Natalie.
and this is
Sophie.
see you next week.